Welcome, bienvenidos y bienvenidas, bienvenue. Este evento cuenta con interpretación en directo en español. Para elegir un canal de audio, haga clic en este botón y seleccione su idioma preferido. Cet événement dispose d'une interprétation en direct en français. Pour choisir un canal audio, cliquez sur ces boutons et sélectionnez la langue de votre choix. This event has live interpretation in English. To choose an audio channel, click on this button and select your preferred language. Interpretation is not available if you are connecting using the Zoom web client and on some mobile phones. Please, when possible, use the desktop app. Here are a few important tips for this call. Since we're many people on this call, microphones will not be active. Nonetheless, for us, it is vital to hear from you. To do so, we will use Slido to ask you questions or opinions throughout the virtual forum. Also, during question and answer segments, your questions will be collected via Slido. To access Slido, go to slido.com, preferably on your mobile phone, and enter in lowercase letters the event code CSSI 2021. Go in now and ask your questions at any time during the session. Don't worry, we will share the information how to access Slido again through the chat. You can also access the chat to talk with fellow attendees or request technical support. However, keep in mind that we will only take questions you share via Slido. Now, there are other ways to get yourself heard too. Until Friday, March 26, we will be conducting a collaborative diagnosis on systemic risk for the education sector in the Caribbean. To take part, you only have to access the online board where you can share your views of what makes up systemic risk in the education sector, what puts pressure on the system, where it tips over, and what you suggest we must do about it. The board is available in English, French, and Spanish through the links now being shared via the chat. Finally, we point out that all sessions will be recorded. Thank you for being here today, and we hope you enjoy.
Welcome participants and colleagues from the National Disaster Management Offices. A special welcome to Minister Rudolf Samuel, Permanent Secretaries and School Safety Focal Points at Ministries of Education and other parties working to implement the Caribbean Safe School Initiative. Welcome to this session, which we see as a particular step in the direction of contributing to fostering a permanent dialogue and enhanced coordination between national entities in charge of disaster risk management and Ministries of Education as a way to ensure school safety. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how a local crisis can quickly cascade across sectors and countries, leaving devastating impacts on economies and the health and well-being of millions of people worldwide, including as well the impact on the education of millions of children. This pandemic has been an example of the systemic nature of risk generated by the extreme levels of interconnectivity in our world today. And to address systemic risk, we require systemic approaches. This means to institutionalize and to strengthen a multi-sectorial and interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary management of different hazards, including biological ones. This includes also promoting an active collaboration between disaster risk management institutions and authorities and platforms and all key sectors such as health, food systems, transportation, but also planning, finances, and of course, education. This also requires an enhanced cooperation and collaboration across sectors and ensure a human-centered approach with a focus on the most vulnerable so that we leave no one behind. The engagement of private sector and civil society is of utmost importance, as well as to promote a greater articulation of science, policy, and practice. In other words, to connect and articulate evidence with decision making. So this is a type of risk governance architecture that we need to build, and it is with this thinking in mind that we aim in this session to capture some of the good practices and lessons learned from those in charge of dealing with this context of multiple hazards such as COVID, a very active hurricane season last year, and even geological hazards in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Hazards that interact with each other, challenging our national and regional capacities. This session will count with the presence of directors and representatives from the National Disaster Management Offices, who will share with us experiences and their perspectives around supporting and collaborating with Ministries of Education to promote school safety. We hope the presentations and the discussions can provide some insights on the challenges and opportunities for further collaboration between the Ministries of Education and National Disaster Management Offices. So some logistics, as my colleague Marcel has mentioned, questions and answers will be received using the Slido portal, as presented in the video in the introduction, using the code CSSI, lower captions, CSSI 2021. And participants can send their questions at any moment during this session. After the presentations, we will have a panel discussion that will count with the participation of the presenters as well as of Ms. Andria Grosvenor, Acting Deputy Executive Director of CDEMA. Finally, I shall mention that participants can take part in the collaborative diagnosis on systemic risk for the education sector while they still have the chance to do so. The inputs are important to collectively build a better understanding of the interconnectedness of risk seen through the lens of the education sector. To participate, they have to click on the link in the chat. In this part of the session, we will hear presentations from Mr. Jasen Penn, Acting Director at the Department of Disaster Management of the British Virgin Islands, followed by Mr. Andrew George, Program Development Officer at the National Emergency Management Organization of St. Lucia, and Ms. Michelle Forbes, Director of the National Emergency Management Organization of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So let me first introduce Mr. Penn in full. Mr. Jasen Penn, Acting Director of the Department of Disaster Management, was appointed in 2021 and first joined the DDM in 1999 and has served in various roles, including Emergency Communications Manager from 2017 to 2020. He holds a Master's Certificate in Development and Public Investment Project Management from the University of Laval, Canada, an Executive Diploma in Management from the Chartered Managers Institute in the UK, and a Bachelor's of Science in Network and Communications Management from DeVry University. Mr. Penn, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for your introduction, and good morning to everyone as well. Don't see the presentation on the screen.
Colleagues, okay. Do we need to share the presentation or does Mr.
One moment.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. It's up now.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you and good morning again, everyone. My presentation will be on the lessons learned here in the BVI in terms of the safe school as well as from the smart school perspective. One thing COVID, we confirm for many of the lessons that were initially learned in responding to the storms in 2017 when it comes to the education arena, is that the concept of the school experience. I'll speak about the concept experience in the schools. Next slide, please. The first lesson we learned was safety first. In this case, safety refers primarily to protecting persons from immediate or physical harm. To keep our students and teachers safe from COVID-19, the territory had to make the decision to shut down schools in March. Likewise, after Hurricane Irma, then Maria in 2017, the schools were simply not safe for safe structures for our students to be in. In the post-hurricane context, returning to a safe learning environment involved erecting temporary classrooms and partnering with civil society and volunteer organizations to ensure that the students had access to water for washing and also using the toilet. Children were reassigned to schools in the neighborhoods and villages, and sometimes in multi-age settings. This also helped to ensure that the structures that were used but didn't need little or no repair helped to accommodate families that were located in sheltering due post impact. So typically what was done is that if there was a particular family that was sheltering in a village, their kids were allowed to be transferred to be closer to them and went to school in that particular village at the time. Now, in a more recent, in a more COVID environment, returning to school in person meant waiting until classroom spaces could be adjusted for students. As you know, all the students could not return as usual. So, and what was also lacking was a lot of new hand washing facilities, and of course, they had to get masks as well. So that's one of the things we had to accommodate in terms of having safety first. Next slide, please. Next lesson, access is everything. For the COVID response, the key focus was being primarily remote learning. The Ministry of Education had to provide a lot of devices for students, where they realized that many of them didn't have them at home. The picture you see here is one of the education officers with a set of 1,000 Chromebooks that were donated by an organization called Unite BVI. There was also other donators as well, Delight, Republic Bank, and a number of different private donors who also contributed. Home internet service was also another issue, where it was realized that a number of students, they had limited access to communications. Thus, that would have damaged the education as well. So one thing that took into effect was that the local service providers, Flow and Digicel, they offered discounted data packages for students and teachers. They even took it a step further, that once it could have been proved that students were accessing educational pages, they allowed them to use their data for free. So no charges went against them, nor the data allotment was diminished. In the post-summer environment, the remote learning was more in the form of, I would say, take-home materials, but it helped to keep the kids, the children focused and have a regular routine, and they were able to stay in contact with the teachers and peers, even though there wasn't space to house all of them, and some for the entire school day. So for those kids that were able to come out, there was sort of like a staggering session where they would, this batch would go to school in the morning, and then the next set would go in the afternoon, sort of to keep them engaged and allow it to still feel as if they were going to school. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry, no, that's fine. Go back. Sorry about that. Thanks. In terms of flexibility, in September when personal education was being phased back in, that's the time right after the following year. There was different approaches to suit different student needs, prioritizing reaching, in particular, to reach the vulnerable students. Students in technical programs that require more hands-on learning, and special education students, and those who weren't striving remotely, they were given the preference of going to the classroom first. Those schools also that had smaller students populations were able to return to in-person learning a lot sooner than the schools that had those large populations. The larger schools, however, were able to accommodate in-person learning by using classrooms on shifts and learning from home for part of the week. So I would have mentioned that earlier. And what they did is the students that maybe had sessions in the morning, and when they went home, they now had the opportunity to access this type of learning via online. Likewise, similarly in 2017, particularly at the secondary level, limited classroom space meant that attended classes had to, as well as do the morning and afternoon shifts. Next slide, please. Lesson learned was collaboration. In addition to partnering with the Department of Disaster Management, where the education sector recently completed their continuity of education plan, the individual school emergency plans, and other educational works with international and regional organizations, as well as the community-based organizations. Some of these examples included the WASH program. This was a program that was done through the Adventist Disaster Relief Agency. And what they provided was portable toilets. They even provided wash stations, installed some of them, which allowed students to have the ability to practice proper hygiene. This was done in 2017. And after the storms, many of the territory schools were also rebuilt by business persons. Many of the early childhood cares were repaired by volunteers, and a number of different organizations came in and did that as well. An example of that was All Hands and Hearts, who came in and helped restructure, helped retrofit a number of damaged schools. In terms of COVID, these partnerships were really built with the public health officers, and a number of local teams were established for within the social distancing task force. Next slide, please. If our collaboration became crucial when we move on to the way forward, which is certifying schools as safe, and then incorporating environmental elements and having schools becoming smart. This is based on the Paris Smart Health Care Facilities concept, which the BVI piloted through the educational sector for a number of years. For those not familiar, the SMART concept in education is built on the 4 key elements: making learning facilities safe and healthy, integrating disaster management practices into the curriculum, promoting climate adaptation, and supporting resilient education. One thing I would say, the BVI was fortunate to have support from UNICEF to create a toolkit to assess schools according to the Ministry of Education's school health and safety policy. We had built up the inventory of safe schools to 23 prior to the 2017 catastrophic hurricanes, and 3 smart schools. But of course, after 2017, we had to start over. And rightfully, again, there was a support of UNICEF, and this time to bring consultants to assist with creating disaster risk reduction and educational material for the students, parents, and teachers, as well as reassess all 51 of the territory school and daycare centers. So that was a great asset for us. So next slide, please. I wouldn't go through this in detail, but this is just to give an idea of where we started from in terms of getting from the safe schools to the starts, where in 1998 we had the first school preparedness assessment. Went out, did the assessments with the schools, to structures. Over the years, training had to be given to the teachers as well as the students. This involved a number of different projects, even including the health sector of it, looking at the kids' diet, including the fire service and other agencies to ensure that fire extinguishers, different elements of the building were in place to ensure that schools could have accommodated the whole safe, healthy, and green. And when the green came in, that was looking towards water conservation, recycling, having green gardens at the school, and so forth. But the bright spot is that since there was so much work done, even prior to 2017, the relationship between the DDM and the education department was well established. And after the time-consuming work of reassessment was carried out and the results shared, we are able to immediately recertify 4 schools as safe today. And the DDM officers were able to support 4 other schools in meeting the safe standards. So right now we are back up to 8. And 4 of those schools were highly motivated to make some adjustments to the environmental and green practices. And they were able to achieve the SMART standard. Together with the Ministry of Education and DDM, we recognized those 8 schools actually in the ceremony last March. And this year our goal is to certifying 5 more safe schools. And we look forward to those fruitful partnerships that we have with the education department. I think that's the end of my presentation based on the lessons learned. And as protocol established, I believe questions would come when we move into the panel discussions. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'll stand by during that period.
Thank you, Mr. Penn. I think your presentation reminds us of the impossibility to disconnect the health, the environmental, the education, and the resilience aspects of education and of children. So we will come back to that. And I also took note of the collaborations you have mentioned with the private sector. Let me just remind you that questions and answers are being received using the Slido portal, and that was presented in the introductory video using the code CSSI 2021, and participants can send their questions at any time. Let me now introduce Mr. Andrew George, Program Development Officer of the National Emergency Management Organization in the Office of the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. Mr. George's responsibilities spans operational readiness, institutional development, community resilience, among others. Mr. George serves as the operational officer at the National Emergency Operations Center, which is activated in response to any event alert. Mr. George has over 12 years of disaster management experiences, incorporating contemporary issues such as climate change adaptation, mass casualties management, and he's also an instructor with USAID FDA certified business continuity manager with the Institute of Business Continuity Management, and a member of the Caribbean Association of Business Continuity Professionals. Mr. George is also a member of the Caribbean Network of Facilitators. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nahuel, for that introduction. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to share some of our experiences in St. Lucia, particularly in the event of our foray into the safe schools and how the issue of COVID and other disasters have shaped our policies on the safe school. Thank you very much. I will now share. Thank you very much. So we're going to look at basically the integration of the disaster risk reduction and the Ministry of Education's National Safe School Agenda. One of the first things we looked at to ensure that there is synergy between the Ministry of Education and, of course, NEMO is the whole issue of our governance and the legislative authority that we have to assist the Ministry of Education. One of the first, of course, is the National Emergency Powers Act number 5 of 95. I'm not going to go through all this, but this one was particularly instructive because it allowed both the Ministry of Health, the National Disaster Office, and the Prime Minister to institute a state of emergency during the pandemic. Having that legislation already there gave us the ability to make adjustments to our governance structure to allow us to be able to respond to the pandemic. The National Disaster Act, also number 30 of 2006. We also have the Education Act number 41 of 1909. This also looks at issues to do with the school plan and ensuring that teachers, students are safe. We expect most of our students to, in St. Lucia particularly, there is mandatory the school system goes from 5 to 16 where students have to be at school. Now, we're spending all that time in school. It's expected that the school plant will be safe because the expectation of parents is that they will send the children to school and they will return after school. So we, as the disaster management practitioners, have to ensure that there is disaster risk reduction principles enshrined in one, locating of the schools, operationalizing the schools, and making sure that the schools, so that makes sure that the schools are as safe as possible within the environment that the children have to. So this was formalized within the National Safe Schools policy to ensure that the school plant is safe. The Industrial and Commercial Buildings, the Fire Safety Act again also looks at ensuring that every school in St. Lucia have separate access and egress. And also because schools in St. Lucia are mostly mainly used as our primary emergency shelters, there are certain things that must be inherent in the school plan to allow it to be converted into an emergency shelter. We are in the process of looking at maybe the possibility of receiving a number of persons from St. Vincent, and I'm sure Ms. Forbes will allude to that. But we have to ensure that anytime our emergency shelters are needed to be used as an emergency shelter of schools, they are able to transition in effectively, and that both the school plan, the school system and the school students will be safe, and also it will be safe to be used as an emergency shelter. Right. Now, just a quick background, what is the National Disaster Office all about? It is, of course, the office responsible for having the nation in a state of readiness in the event of a disaster and coordinating the nation's response to a disaster event locally, nationally, and regionally. Now, with COVID-19, that was one area where we and the Ministry of Health had to provide support to each other to ensure that the country responded to this event. Within the school plant, again, we had to ensure that the governance of the school plant will ensure that the school system was safe, and it's about governance to ensure that we made the right decisions. Schools were closed very early in the pandemic to ensure that we stop the spread of the COVID-19. Up to now, the school plant is still closed because of the lingering effects of the COVID. Although we have begun our vaccination drive in St. Lucia, the vaccine is used from 18 and over. So most of our school plant and school children of school age will not receive the vaccine as yet. We have a number of our standard operating procedures that guided us during the COVID-19 experience. And one of the things we look at is, of course, the school safety policy and how it could affect the governance of the school system to ensure that all schools in St. Lucia have a model that they could use to standardize the processes of ensuring that they are safe. And that policy would be entrenched in making sure that all the schools, the governance of the school, which is the principals, ensure that they follow this plan. One of the things, or the second thing we looked at is the issue of shared responsibility. We believe that, of course, having the Ministry of Education be responsible for ensuring that the school plans are ready to be safe, it's also inherent on us to ensure that the Ministry of Education has the resources and the assistance necessary to ensure that they are able to support the students and the school system. So this relationship between ourselves, the National Disaster and the Ministry of Education, has been long. It has happened over a long period of time, and it happened. The genesis started because the Ministry of Education are the custodians of our school system, as I said, and because our schools are shelters, the Chief Education Officer is Chief Shelter Manager, and that person is responsible for operationalizing all our shelters. And so that has built our relationship with the Ministry of Education. And so we also support them in the inspection of all the schools on a yearly basis to ensure that they are able to be used as emergency shelters. Also, we ensure that anytime the school system is damaged by any event, that the resources and mobilizing some of the resources to ensure that our school plant is effective. So these are some of the issues that we use. So we use our relationship with CDEMA, some of our donor partners, to ensure that the Ministry of Education receives all the assistance that it requires. As you can see here from the National Emergency Structure, the Ministry of Education and the Chief Education Officer, as I said, is the chair of the National Shelters Committee. I'm going to work quickly through this one. It's basically looking at the role of our National Emergency Management Advisory Committee, where the Ministry of Education sits to be able to provide policy guidance and to ensure that the school systems are represented at the highest level of the disaster management system in St. Lucia, so that they can address any issues which requires the Ministry of Education, the Chief Education Officer, and the School Safety Officer can then make representation to ensure that the progress made within the school system to ensure that the school system are safe we can look at the strengths, we can look at some of the gaps and provide guidance to ensure that at the end of the day, the school system is safe. One of the things we will look at, of course, I will look at some of the events that has happened in the past. We have some of the that have affected the school system. Definitely, our school system have also been impacted. In the Christmas Eve trough of 2013 impacted the Canaries Infant School. It became flooded, and that's one of the schools that had to be completely rebuilt because it was totally destroyed. We have 6 facilities in Canaries and Seven View Fort that were flooded, and 1 primary school requiring complete reconstruction. The damages to the education sector was reported at $731,000 with losses of $134,000. And of course, the losses are attributed to the cost of repair of the schools, loss of education material, and supply. The combined damage and loss for the education sector from that Christmas Eve flood amounted to $865,000. And as you can see, this is one of our primary schools after Hurricane Thomas, where the school is built in a flood-prone area, and it gets severely impacted by floods whenever there's a flood event, because that whole area is in a floodplain. Now, I'm not going to touch too long on the National School Safety Policy. Mr. Gomez, who is there, I'm sure will be doing a lot more of that. But it provides the context for amendment of the existing legislation to integrate disaster risk reduction and environmental protection measures for schools in the implementing countries, and that's one of the countries being St. Lucia. with trying to ensure that our schools are there. Now, one of the things that we, of course, we look at is ensuring that we strengthen our partners. Strengthening of the partners in that case is the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Education has received training, they have received policy guidance, and they have also received our own interventions to ensure that through our partners, whether it's USA or the CDEMA, that there is training in school safety, that all teachers are aware of the need to ensure that they are operating in a safe school. We've done assessments of the various schools to look at where where they can be strengthened to ensure that they receive that safe school certification. This strengthening of the relationship is very, very important to the National Disaster Office, because it allows us to leverage some of our resource mobilization and partnership with various agencies, both locally, regionally, internationally, to be able to strengthen not only just the school system, but also where we look at some of our private sector donations coming in to assist the schools in making sure that they have all what they need. And particularly with COVID, I know Mr. Penn alluded to the relationship with some of the internet providers. That also happened in St. Lucia. We had a lot of the donations of the ebooks for students to use, and that's one of the very lessons learned, is also the cost of the internet for students, and how now that can be used to ensure that students have a blended approach to learning, and that carried forward after the COVID, so that students who are from more economically deprived areas can receive the same level of education, the same level of internet connection and connectivity as persons. We have certain areas based on the census where the internet penetration is very low. Some of the rural communities' internet penetration is low. So that is something that has been a major lesson for both at the national level and also in our telecommunications policy, to see how we can build on allowing persons in those areas with low internet penetration to have some more internet penetration. One of the things we look at, of course, the National School Safety Policy Committee has a broad cross-sector of persons. The Ministry of Education and NEMO serve as the chair and the deputy chair of that committee, because it's essential that the disaster risk reduction agenda are aligned directly with the school safety policy. So to ensure that schools being built, fitted, do have do integrate disaster risk reduction in both the design and of those schools. And so this will help in ensuring that the buildings are safe, and they are also more structurally sound, and they have more ability to be able to continue after the event. As we say, a number of schools in St. Lucia, Grenada, Dominica have been destroyed by weather events, and once this happens, that delays the start of the schools. Particularly when they have to be used as emergency shelters, it is then you're not able to use it in the school system. The governance arrangements ensures that the Ministry of Education receive the institutional support to implement a robust safe schools policy and program. So that is very important to us in St. Lucia. So that at the national level, we have to ensure both the governance, institutional arrangements, strengthening of the actors, and this coherence to ensure that there is coherence in what we do at the national level and what is done at the sectoral level, and which is the Ministry of Education, to ensure that they both dovetail into ensuring that the country is as resilient as possible, and that persons who are vulnerable receive all the tools and the interventions necessary to reduce their vulnerability. We also allow NEMO actors to work better together, because we find working together, we can achieve more. And that is the mantra that we have to adopt. And also that disaster risk reduction and school safety is a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility not just between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry and the disaster office, but all the other actors and players within the disaster management environment, and to ensure that all actors understand the relationships between the Ministry of Education, the NEMO system, and how we can all support to ensure the resilience of the school system. I talked about the relationship and the ensuring that there is a whole of society approach and a whole of governance approach, a whole of government approach, because we want to make sure that the government, continuity of government is important, continuity of the Ministry of Education is important. The Ministry of Education is responsible to ensure that the school system works, so which means that the Ministry of Education must have a continuity of operations plan to ensure that it knows how to ensure that schools continue and the school system continues even after a disaster event, which prevents them from having the school plans, because now with the pandemic, the school plans are not available, but the school system has to continue and schooling has to continue through ebooks and other blended approaches. As we continue to the attainment of our Sendai framework and the sustainable development goals. Just a quick picture of the two of our most damaged schools. Say thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of that information with you, and I will be available to answer any questions after the panel discussion. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks to Nahuel and for allowing the National Disaster Office the opportunity to partake in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that comprehensive presentation, and very interesting to see how that principle of co-responsibility and whole of government approach is being integrated into normative frameworks. But at the same time, we see how the schools continue to be affected by disasters. So perhaps in the panel, we should go back to what is not working that well. What of that is in the frameworks, in the practices, in the arrangements, where are things falling between the cracks? So now let me introduce Ms. Michelle Forbes, Director of the National Emergency Management Organization of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. She joined the staff of the NEMO in 2004 as Deputy Director. Ms. Forbes holds a Bachelor's of Science in International Disaster Engineering and Management from Coventry University in the UK. She was awarded the Fulbright Scholarship in 2008 and went on to complete her Master's in Administration and Graduate Certificate in Disaster Management, Andrews Young School of Policy Studies, US. Mrs. Forbes was appointed. Ms. Forbes was appointed to the post of Director of the University. Before you the floor, let me remind you that we are receiving questions through the Slido portal that we using the code CSSI 2021, which will also be used. Ms. Forbes, the floor is.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias, bonjour, tout le monde. Okay, I'm just going to thank you for having us on this forum today. I'm just going to speak to you about just some of the good practices we have had here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and some lessons learned in our interaction with the Ministry of Education and the Caribbean School Safety Initiative, and of course, in the multi-hazard environment, the systemic risk that we face here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The Ministry of Education is integral in our national disaster management structure. We have 10 committees under the National Disaster Management System, of which the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education leads the Shelter Management Subcommittee, and the Chief Education Officer is actually the Chief Shelter Manager when it comes to emergencies and dealing with shelters. Now, this structure transcends across all emergencies, and particularly still in the COVID-19 environment, where the Health Services Committee would have been able to collaborate directly with the Ministry of Education in terms of guidelines for schools, when, you know, recommendations as to what should be happening in schools, sanitizing stations, what should be in schools to allow them to operate in a safe environment. And this was all coordinated on the national structure. As a matter of fact, since March 2020, the Emergency Operations Center here at NEMO has been activated, and the Ministry of Health Disaster Services Committee has been, Health Services Committee has been activated. And this is where we actually collaborate with them, ensuring that all the information relating to COVID is disseminated, and the dialogue with the various sectors, such as the Ministry of Education. As so much of our good practice, we have done quite a lot of work with the Ministry of Education, looking at the whole school safety package, the knowledge management in particular over the years. And two of our good programs that we have had a lot of buy-in with the Ministry of Education is our tsunami program and our volcano awareness activities, which I'll show a few pictures on the next slide. And this is where we actually have, as part of our program that was sponsored through the CDEMA and UNESCO, where we have schools in Union Islands becoming tsunami smart, tsunami ready, taking part in the drills. And we have done a lot of work also on mainland St. Vincent. And our volcano awareness activities annually, of course, it was affected the last 2 years because of the COVID-19 situation. We actually work with the Ministry of Education in almost all schools as possible in terms of doing the information and knowledge on the volcanic risks. As you know, we are actually in a volcanic emergency at the moment, effusive eruption ongoing at the La Soufrière volcano here on mainland St. Vincent. And this is the work we have done with the Ministry of Education has really allowed us to be more present in the community and in the schools in terms of sharing the information on volcanic hazards and threats. And now that we're actually in emergency, so the children over the years have been able to understand what we're doing. Catering for the needs of the impacted population. This is where we have worked with the Ministry of Education over the years. In particular, if we have an emergency and shelters have to be activated, the arrangements that we have with the Ministry of Education is that the supplies that they have within their school feeding program, they actually handed over and used by NEMO to feed the persons within the shelters. And of course, after the emergency, we actually replenish the Ministry of Education stock. So this is something that has been ongoing for a number of years, put in place then by the permanent secretary you were seeing there in the Ministry of Education back then, Mrs. Bernadette Baker. And in that photo, you also see the Deputy Chief Education Officer there, and the Chief Education Officer at that time, who has always been critical in our emergency management operations within the national structure. We collaborate a lot. We collaborate a lot with the Ministry of Education. The school safety program was actually started in recent times, I will put, because I'm seeing some of the documentation that we would have had some semblance of school safety program many years ago, even before NEMO existed. But in the current environment, the school safety program really started with NEMO and the USA through the USAID off the program in 2009. And it is through us that the training for the teachers actually started then. Then of course it was handed over to the Ministry of Education once they had that unit being developed within the Ministry of Education for school safety. And that is one area that we continue to collaborate in terms of the school safety program, development of plans, etc., so that we ensure that we are quite strengthen that particular area. In terms of curriculum development, this is one area that NEMO actually advocated over a number of years, and I think that came about especially after Hurricane Ivan in 2004. The then director was pushing a lot with the Ministry of Development Planning, Economic Planning, to have a project that we can actually work on curriculum development for natural hazards in particular to be incorporated in the national curriculum. Now it's with the Ministry of Education. They have some activities and curriculum development for age 13, I think, and onwards. We would have liked to see it for the more younger age group. That was our intention when we were advocating that. But we're hoping that that can actually spread throughout the entire, from kindergarten throughout the entire school levels. Shelter management is a big topic for St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the context of the COVID-19 environment. We have been collaborating with Dr. Ferdinand and the team over the last few weeks in training for shelter managers, especially those new schools also that have been identified to be volcano emergency shelters. And this has been ongoing over a number of years, but we have actually speeded up a bit over the last few months because we don't know what is going to happen, and we are approaching the next hurricane season. In terms of the COVID-19 environment, we were able to work with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health in determining our COVID-19 protocols, which were in effect since last year and actually spills over into this year with the wearing of masks and the distancing within the emergency shelters, because most of our emergency shelters are schools or churches. And of course, during the volcanic emergency, the Ministry of Education have actually activated their committee and have been working with the custodians of the schools to ensuring that they are in a constant state of readiness in the event of a volcanic eruption. Logistics support, we do a lot of collaborate with the ministry, a lot of that. After emergencies, we ensure that the schools are clean, whether we provide the supplies, provide the personnel to assist at the schools. And also just before school open, we do lend some support to the Ministry of Education, ensuring that furniture and a lot of things get to the schools on time. Those two photos that you see is part of our annual program that we actually target one school a year, mainly the fourth formers, and we actually take them up on the hike out to the volcano. That was before 2020, of course. And so you would have seen a school there, a school here on the hike out to the volcano, right here. And on the photo below, that was an evacuation drill in 2019. No, 2020 actually, that we did in Union Island, that the Ministry of Education took part in. So that was actually a school that evacuated as part of the exercise. There are opportunities. We are collaborating, we are doing some things well, but there's still opportunities in the national environment with us and the Ministry of Education. One of the things that we are seeing is a safe schools program to be integrated into our country work program, what is happening, what the ministry is doing, so that we can all collaborate and be able to understand each other's work and actually have it across different thematic areas that we need to advance the whole school safety initiative. One of the things that we're seeing also that we need to be able to collaborate a bit more, leveraging funds to advance the National Safe Schools Program. For example, we have the country directed fund through CDEMA. How can we work a little better with Ministry of Education and seeing if we have a component of a project, just as how we did in the Tsunami Smart program. We have a couple of schools that we work with in terms of developing their school safety plans, in particular for tsunami hazard. How can we now leverage funds to advance the national school safety program throughout St. Vincent and the Grenadines? And that, of course, also includes the building the capacity and strengthening the structures of the schools, that we know that there's some that are lagging behind. Opportunities also in the multi-hazard environment, in the systemic risk, is for the ministry to really grasp the opportunity of undertaking a risk assessment for particular hazard. And of course, in the decision making by the ministry, you have the information. What decision is the ministry taking? Not necessarily what NEMO is telling you to do or what the Ministry of Health is telling you to do. We find sometimes that a lot of the sectors maybe just sit back and think that the NEMOs are going to tell you, hey, you need to do X, Y, or Z. But we provide you with the information for you to make an informed decision, because you have to determine how it's going to impact your sector, how it's going to impact instructional time for your students, how we're going to recover, and what are we going to do in terms of a volcanic emergency if you have students evacuating from the northeast, northwest part of the island. How is education going to continue when the schools are occupied? Those are the decision making and the impact-based scenario planning we would like to see opportunities for the Ministry of Education. I think I just have one more slide. In terms of the shelter policy development and even the school safety policy, we are moving now into actually going to start a consultancy today, looking at the whole shelter policy and our shelter training. And we hope to bring the new and emerging issues over the years that I know the Ministry of Education and the whole school safety initiative needs to take into consideration. Also the whole issue of child protection in emergencies. How do we incorporate it in that whole school safety, and not just that child protection during normal school environment. We are seeing now a lot of children at home, and they're at risk of can be at risk of abuse in certain communities. How do you incorporate some of them into the shelter policy in the shelters and the psychosocial issues? We have always had some challenges here with the psychosocial issues, in that, you know, the counselors may be at 8 to 4, but sometimes it's especially in emergencies, the students may need a little bit more counseling, a little bit more interaction, and see what is actually happening at home. Why are they in the shelter? Have they lost their school books? Have they lost their school uniform? You know, those are some of the things that we have been working with, but we can actually cement them a bit more. In terms of the school safety plans, I think we need to, can be standard corrected, we need to ensure that there's a channel for the approval of the school safety plans nationally, so that we can go forward and be an example and be a shining light in terms of how are we rolling out the school safety plans throughout St. Vincent and the Grenadines. What the approval process, is there a board, is there a small committee that includes NEMO as part of that whole process? In terms of disaster risk management across education sector, we still see in many of the countries that you have a small unit that is dealing with the school safety program and school safety initiative, and sometimes it's seen as only dealing with the natural hazards part of it. But it has to be integrated with across the entire education sector, across the entire education policy framework, to really be meaningful and be driven. Because if they're not often thought about, except if there's an emergency, except if there's a shelter to be activated, or except if somebody wants to develop their school plan, you know, so it needs to go beyond that across the entire sector. One great opportunity that we have seen here in St. Vincent, and we have already indicated to the Ministry of Education, that the assessment tool, I can't remember the name, that has been piloted by CDEMA in terms of assessing the schools in terms of their school safety guidelines, that we want to be able to adapt that and use it for the shelter inspection process, the component, so that we, when the Ministry of, whether it's the Ministry of Education do the assessment in collaboration with all the other entities, one assessment is done and we determine the shelter, if it's an emergency shelter or not, and be able to identify some of the gaps that it may have, so that these can roll out into the programs and projects later on down the road, as we look at building the whole safety structure and culture within the school environment. So these are some of the opportunity, the good practices we have had in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, some collaboration that we have actually had with the Ministry of Education and continue to have. We have always had a good working relationship with the ministry, and we know that will continue in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Forbes, for that comprehensive presentation. And thank you for outlining some of the challenges and opportunities ahead for not only stronger collaboration, but also strengthening capacities across the sectors. Let me now move us into the discussion segment. And for that, I'd like to welcome Ms. Andria Grosvenor, who will be our first target for the first two questions, but then we'll have a discussion with the presenters as well. So Andria, as we probably all know, is currently the acting Deputy Executive Director of CDEMA. She has been the focal point for reporting on the regional achievement of results of the comprehensive disaster management strategy, which contributes to the Sendai disaster risk reduction framework. She was also the lead facilitator for the consultation leading to the development of the document on building a pathway for Caribbean resilience 2017-2018. And in the current portfolio, she leads the Technical Program Management Division with responsibility for the strategic and technical leadership in the agency's integrated disaster risk management program, which spans preparedness, response, recovery, disaster risk reduction, research, training, education, and safe schools program. So on a small portfolio, Andrea. Andrea has a bachelor's in geography and master's in business administration and a master's certificate in monitoring and evaluation, as well as being a certified trainer in business continuity planning. So Andrea, welcome, and let us start with this question. How is CDEMA, a regional body, supporting school safety? And after that, I will be asking about your main recommendations in terms of what suggestions to our school safety focal points in the Ministries of Education, and as well as to our colleagues in the NEMOs. But let's start hearing from you how, from a regional perspective and a regional body, CDEMA is supporting school safety. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for your question. And I want to also say a pleasant good morning to our high-level participants, my esteemed panel colleagues, and participants from our national disaster offices, Ministries of Education, and other stakeholders. You know, at CDEMA, we do recognize the nature of risk is systemic. And we do need to move away from that traditional idea that events are isolated. And we recognize, therefore, that there is a need for systemic risk governance to appropriately match the nature of systemic risk. And in the context of comprehensive disaster management, CDEMA does advance on all hazards, all phases, all people's approach to resilience in an integrated manner, including the promotion of intersectoral approaches. And in that context, this network approach to risk governance is inherent in our CDM approach. Education is a key priority area in the context of CDM, and we have been happy to advance the Caribbean Safe School Initiative, which provides the framework under which the Caribbean will implement the World Initiative on Safe Schools. We have been financed by a number of development partners, and I want to acknowledge them at the outset: the Austrian Development Agency, the Caribbean Development Bank, the European Union, United Nations Children's Fund, and most recently, the government of Norway. And in some of the in the rollout of these initiatives, we have partnered very well with the UNDRR and our states in moving these matters forward. So the support has allowed us to facilitate the countries in a number of ways, and I will highlight 4 areas. Institutionally, we have supported in the development of national safe school policies, and this might have been mentioned by 1 or 2 of the presenters, which define the concept of safe schools in countries and help to highlight the issues that needs to be addressed, and also to look at how do we advance and strengthen these arrangements in countries. On the issue of coordination, we've supported 4 countries in development of national safe school committees, which are multi-sectoral, with representation from various ministries, which have a stake in the school safety agenda. We have strongly recommended that this be led by the Ministry of Education and the National Disaster Office, and include representatives from climate change in the context of that nexus between climate change and climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk management. In St. Kitts Nevis, for instance, this has been built upon by the establishment of a 3-tier governance structure that goes right from the national level going down to the level of the school. And the establishment of this coordination arrangement facilitates the familiarity of actors that can work together in blue skies, but also in gray skies time. I also want to say in this context, as well as we work with Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts Nevis, Dominica, and St. Lucia, these committees also had their inaugural meetings in the first half of 2018 and would have developed their work plans, so they have an instrument that can guide them through the work that is to be implemented, and these work plans can be systematically updated. And practically, we have given practical support, and we've also been able to have some products available. So we've converted the existing paper-based Model Safe Schools program tool into an electronic format, and we've been able to test it. We have been able to enhance the building condition assessment element of the Model Safe Schools Program Toolkit. We've provided training for assessors in 6 CDB borrowing member countries, and delivering that training on the tools and the standards for school safety. We've also been able to conduct hazard risk assessments in 33 schools across those 6 countries and prepare costed action plans for reducing or eliminating the risks that were identified during the school assessments. And interestingly enough, coming out of those school safety plans, we have actually been able to support recently in 2020 in St. Lucia, a total of about 10 schools in being able to implement areas within their action plans. And we're looking also to target the remainder of the schools in advancing those in those other countries. So I said 4 areas, but I just want to add one small area, but I think, and because I think it's important, this is the whole area of governance, and this is looking at this whole regional national connection. CDEMA, as we indicated, practices a network approach to governance with cross-cutting issues, and the establishment of the Safe School Working Group at the regional level brings together a regional group of entities chaired by the CSSI and the partners working on school safety. So this group actually sits under the Education Sector Subcommittee of the CDM Coordination and Harmonization Council. And so therefore we have a linkage between now the regional governance and the national governance that's already established or is to be established in countries, showing this these linkages in terms of advancing the Safe Schools agenda. And I will rest there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for outlining those 4.5 points. But let me. Where are we failing? Because we are working on the regional and national governance and links, and we are working on policies. We are working on coordination. We are working on tools. We have even implemented hazard risk assessment with costed action plans, right? So where are we failing? Where are the challenges? Is it that those action plans or those policies are not being looked at? Are those policies not being funded? Or actually we are in the right track? So it's a matter of time until we really have the right skills in the right places and the right connections. What's your take on this?
I think actually that you have actually placed on the table a number of the issues. So thank you so much for that. I think one of the matters is actually time. So there is a time for this agenda to evolve. There's some time for it to take root, and there's also some time for it to be able to spread and for you to see the results. That being said, we are also in an environment where the nature of our risk is as such is that we don't have the benefits of time, that we have to move much more rapidly. We have to be able to have things happen a lot quicker. And so to that extent, it seems a little bit as though the program is lagging behind what we really would want, because in the past year, we have seen that the whole matter of the cascading of these effects, COVID-19 starting, in the middle of a drought situation. And this would have affected things like hand washing and hygiene measures, and how this would have affected schools. And then we've gone into a hurricane season. 2020 which was above average hurricane season, and the impacts there, but also looking into this hurricane season coming up. So there are things that are happening that pushes the exposure agenda, so rapidly that we can't be in a position where we are playing catch up. We have to really be moving at a much quicker pace to be able to address the reality of the multi-hazard nature of the Caribbean environment. So it's very important, therefore, that we look at the whole matter of 2 things, I would say. I would say financing. So CDEMA has tried to get some financing from a number of partners, I've mentioned them before, to support the countries. But we also recognize that there are a number of initiatives that's going to be led at the national level. So this has to be also a conversation at the national level in terms of the prioritization of a number of these actions and how do we move them forward. So I think that this is something that is important, is critical, having the Ministries of Finance, for instance, on board. I know that will probably be covered in another section, but these are all part of the conversation. The other piece of it that I want to say is the whole matter of the integration. We recognize this integrated approach to risk management is absolutely critical. We recognize that we are in this systemic risk agenda, and there are hazards that we are probably not given the full recognition to, or they're sort of latent, and they eventually raise their head because we don't necessarily see the connections, and we have these cascading impacts, etc. So the whole call for that integrated approach to risk management is absolutely critical, and therefore I was there in these committees. There are a number of the actors that are already on board. I think that the integrated nature is something that we do need to strengthen, because I think that whilst I think we recognized it and it is a CDM approach, in a lot of ways it may not have been sufficiently mainstreamed into the thinking of how we do business. I think that the experience of the last year has really put that on the table so squarely that there is probably a better appetite and there's a better opportunity for leveraging those experiences of the last year, albeit difficult, to sort of show those interconnection of things and how we can be able to move the agenda forward. Because we've heard in presentations, it's issues related to the physical elements, but there are issues related to technology, there's issues related to knowledge management, there's issues related to how we treat with the hazards, the impact of hazards that are coming on the school environment and the society at large. So this is really the opportunity for us to really grasp this and to move it forward in a much more comprehensive, efficient, and effective way.
Thank you very much. Yes, we need to, we were saying at the beginning, we need to approach this systemic risk with systemic approaches. There's no other way, and leave those siloed approaches behind. I wanted to start picking up some of the questions that we have received from the audience, and wanted to go to Ms. Forbes. You mentioned earlier that you were working and supporting the Ministry of Education so they can improve their risk-informed decisions, Ms. Forbes. So what are the essential actions for safe return to schools? How are you, how is the NEMO interacting with the Ministry of Education to make those decisions? Ms. Forbes?
Okay, thank you. We will interact through the Ministry of Health, in particular the Health Services Committee. For example, I know we would have discussed the reopening of schools and what the Chief Medical Officer would want to have to see in place. I wouldn't say what we have now, because I know that has just been shared with the Prime Minister and Cabinet in terms of recommendations for the safe opening of schools. So we dialogue more with the Ministry of Health in terms of putting forward the conversation and the dialogue in terms of what do we want to see in place for this safe opening of schools. In particular, I know we have already indicated to the Ministry of Health that we do have of education, that we do have PPEs in stock, that if those things are needed. So we really do, in the national mechanism, we channel it through the Ministry of Health in terms of outlining the criteria that we need to see in place before schools are reopened.
Thank you. And would you, perhaps going back now to Mr. George, how you mentioned the use and the policies behind using schools as shelters, but I think COVID has made us realize that we need to to also integrate a whole set of measures to have a shelter function in the midst of a pandemic. What were those measures that were integrated or taken into consideration in St. Lucia?
Thank you, Nahuel. Yes, one of the things we're looking at, of course, with the issue of building some purpose-built emergency shelters and evacuation centers. That is something that we have had some discussion, and we are having some discussion with some funding to look at whether or not we can find some way of having some purpose-built emergency shelters. That is something that we feel is in the best interest of ensuring that we do that. We are expanding the number of shelters that we have on island. What we have on island basically is to use public buildings, government buildings, schools, churches. So we have now explored the possibility of using some private sector buildings and to use some of those large buildings that are available to go in some MOUs with some of the owners, the private sector owners, to give us more access to emergency shelters and emergency space. Particularly during the pandemic, we realize, of course, the new recommendations of having 9 by 9, 81 square feet per person for an emergency shelter makes most of the shelters we have inadequate for the numbers. So that we have had to expand a number of shelters within the community, even just locally. And as Ms. Forbes mentioned, we are in the process of looking at whether or not, because of human mobility and people leaving one disaster area to go to a next country as a result of a disaster, we had to host a number of persons from Dominica after Hurricane Maria in 2017. We are looking at the possibility of hosting a number of persons from St. Vincent, our sister islands. Whenever something happens to them, we have to come forward as part of the CDEMA mechanism to offer our assistance. So for us to get more space in the shelters, we have to look at more private sector buildings and eventually, hopefully, to build some purpose-built emergency shelters.
Thank you. So having more shelters to reduce the density and ensure that those measures are in place. Thank you very much. And I would like now to go to Mr. Penn. You highlighted the number of collaborations that you had with the private sector. You had donations from United VDI. You have a collaboration with Digicel. And that reminds me of the importance of the telecom sector. Have you had, or what kind of interactions you've had with sectors such as telecommunications and energy, and beyond the education? We understand that a whole set of infrastructure systems are also required to ensure business continuity. So if you could tell us a little bit more about your collaborations with the private sector, how important is that, and with other sectorial ministries such as energy, telecoms, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Besides the engagement that we had with just from the education sector, one of the issues that happened to us during Irma was the fact that we had multiple service providers and there were a number of different communications that were still available, but persons could not communicate across platforms. So coming out of that particular issue, an agreement or MOU was signed where in the fact that if there's an emergency, all networks would open where persons could just speak freely across the entire different network systems. In addition to that too, what also came out of the particular catastrophe with Irma across other sectors, in particular the electrical corporations, what they've opted to is there are key buildings that they would ensure that they restore power to first. That would be in the event the hospital, EOC, any type of shelters, any critical government facilities, they would be the first that they would also restore power to. Now, I did mention Unite BVI as one of our donors, but what we've also gained from the different donorship, the private sector, one of the things that they did, they donated a number of satellite communications, VSATs, generators, any type of critical supplies that were needed for particular communities. I'll just give a quick example. We have a number of different islands. What the private sector did for one of the main islands is they pretty much set up a whole distribution and relief for that particular island. They provided beds, they provided clean water, they provided food, they flew a whole support team in some instances to help that particular island, which was well appreciated. So that's some of the measures that that's some of the, I guess, the positive high points that we got from the private sector coming together and helping us in a time when we really did need it.
Thank you. That underscores the importance of this dialogue with the private sector, who's responsible of 75 to 85% of investments in any given country, and but not only from a social responsibility perspective, but also looking at the investments and the incentives that are required so that infrastructures are resilient, and those investments create reduce risk instead of create more risk. So that it's something that we need to keep in mind. I wanted to, we have a final question, and that I wanted to perhaps open it to anyone that would like to take it. How do we do, what is needed to shift to a culture of prevention, rather than, perhaps we are perhaps it's a matter of time, as Andrea was saying. We are slightly moving to having a more integrated approach and more of a preventive actions rather than reactive. But what's missing to create that culture of prevention in our societies? Open to anybody who wants to share their thoughts.
I'll be happy to share my thoughts. I actually, it's interesting that the question has been asked, because there is one of the recommendations that I was thinking about as we look at the question that you said that you'll ask eventually. One of the recommendations I was thinking through in terms of even the working together of this, the safe school leads and the disaster officers, etc. It's around the whole context of the resilience framework. A culture of safety is really part of the matters being considered within the context of CDM and knowledge management. And in order for behavior to change, you have to first have the knowledge of what of what is required for a movement to behavior, of the change in behavior. Now, we recognize that based on a number of the awareness campaigns that we've had with sometimes different areas affecting society, that sometimes the knowledge in the head does not necessarily go to the heart, and the behavior may not actually change. But I want to say that as you are aware, the Caribbean approved a resilience framework by the heads of government of the Caribbean community in 2018, following the devastating impacts of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And this was actually something that was, in terms of the engagement around it, it was not only in the region, but we had also had engagement around it at the global platform in Colombia in 2018. And I think that this is this whole matter of understanding what resilience means, for instance, to the Caribbean, why the resilience is needed, and also in being able to advance on those 5 pillars of resilience, needs very much to be infused into the teaching within the schools. I want to borrow a statement from the CDM youth, and I will provide a shortened version. Children are the present and the future. We often talk about children as the future, but they are the present as well, and they are the future. And the Caribbean Resilience Framework and those 5 pillars and those tenets needs to be infused into the various subjects within the school curricula in understandable ways, so that this whole notion of a culture of safety becomes commonplace. Children are here now, and they will move into the future perhaps without our presence. And we have the task to prepare them now and for the future. So the fusion approach into the school curricula at the operational level is really congruent with that integrated risk management approach, which is the essence of comprehensive disaster management. And I know this is also agreed, even not in terms of a philosophical approach, by other neighboring countries that are not even members of the CDEMA system. So I think that we have to create new pathways of thinking so that we can create new pathways of action. And that is how you are able to move into having the culture change. And really, the children and the school environment becomes a wonderful opportunity for changing those ways of thinking, that we can change those pathways of a different behavior towards a culture of safety.
Thank you, Andrea. I think that's perfect for closing. We are slightly over time, but yes, children are agents of change. So that's where we could also strengthen our culture, infusing that culture of prevention. But you know, we have discussed in this session about this core responsibility, whole of government approach to school safety and to resilience in general, that requires capacities and skills in throughout and across all the sectors. And that it also includes that, you know, implies that we have capacities for risk assessments, for data collection, for data analysis, and informed decision making in different sectors to support resilient actions, or actions that build resilience, and those collaborations as well with other partners, including the private sector, so that we also tackle the issue of financing, not only in terms of, you know, donations and things like that, but also in terms of ensuring that those investments coming from the public sector or the private sector build resilience, do not create more risk, but build resilience. So I would like to thank everyone for your participation and sharing your thoughts and your insights. Thank you very much. I would especially like to recognize Minister Samuel, Dr. Rudolf Samuel, Minister of Education, Culture, Youth and Sport of St. Martin, who has been a very attentive participant of this session. And he's the co-chair of the Caribbean Safe School Initiative, as well as is going to be the host of next year's session. So Dr. Samuel, thank you very much, and thanks to all the audience for your attention. Before closing, I would like to invite you all to technical session number 3, Intersectorial Partners, which is going to take place tomorrow at 10 a.m. Barbados time. This is a session in which we will further look at how education can connect with other sectors, and we'll discuss examples that include solarization in the Bahamas post-Hurricane Dorian, intersectoral work during the response of Hurricane Maria in Dominica, implementation of TRR curriculum, and an experience from Vanuatu in the Pacific. Excellent to have those learnings from across the world. So it will be a very dynamic session tomorrow that we are preparing with the collaborative brainstorming, and we really expect the audience to participate. So that it's tomorrow at 10 a.m. So thank you all very, very much. I really enjoyed this conversation and this sharing of experiences, as well as outlining the challenges that we have ahead. So this is a collective effort. Thank you all very much. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Nahuel.
Thank you.